Ivy and Bean, Bound to be Bad. Written by Annie Barrows. Illustrated by Sophie Blackhall. Bean, Queen of Bad. In Mrs. Trance's yard there were 2 rows of rose bushes, one on either side of the front path. Each rose bush had a little circle of dirt to live in. Each circle of dirt had a tiny white fence around it, and then a sea of sparkly white rocks stretching out around that. Sometimes Mrs. Trance came outside and washed her front path. Sometimes she even washed her rocks. Mrs. Trance liked things to be very clean. When she saw dirt, her face shriveled into a frown. When she saw children, her eyes narrowed into tiny slivers. When she saw dirty children, her frown sucked her lips all the way inside her mouth and her eyes slivered into nothing. She frowned so hard her face went away. Bean drove Mrs. Trance crazy. She didn't try to, she just did. Every time Bean walked by Mrs. Trance's house, one of the tiny white fences circling around the rose bushes fell over. Bean didn't know how it happened. Then Mrs. Trance would call Bean's mother and say that Bean was destructive. That meant she wrecked things. Bean didn't know quite what she was going to do to Mrs. Trance's yard, but it wouldn't be boring, that was for sure. She stood in front of the stiff rose bushes and looked carefully to see if Mrs. Trance was peeking from behind her curtains. The coast was clear. "Do something," yelled Dino. "This is boring." Boring? Bean would show him. She leaned over the tiny white fence and brought her face close to a rose, and then she spit on it as hard as she could. She turned around to face Dino. "How was that, huh? You'd never do that." Ivy grabbed her by the shoulders. "Bean," she cried, "promise you'll never do that again. You're hurting the flowers, and they have feelings too." Oh, right. Just for a second, Bean had forgotten about turning good. "Yeah, sure, I'll never do it again," she told Ivy. "She's reformed," yelled Ivy. But Bean whirled around to make sure Dino was watching. "Oh no," she hollered. "It didn't stick. I'm turning bad again." This time the Sophies clapped along with Katie. "Ha! Bean was the queen of bad. Keep your eyes peeled," she screeched and started to run toward her house. Bean knew a lot of things that Nancy didn't know she knew. One of the things she knew was where Nancy hid candy. Nancy thought she was pretty smart. She didn't hide candy in her own room. She hid it in the bathroom, behind the stacks of toilet paper, in a brown paper bag. What Nancy didn't know was that Bean spent a lot of time prowling around the house looking for treasure. One day, when she was prowling in the bathroom, Bean found Nancy's paper bag full of candy. Bean was always careful not to eat so much candy that Nancy would notice. Just a Tootsie Roll or a mini candy bar, that's all she ever took. Until today. Bean whisked into her house and rushed to the bathroom. Bean often rushed to the bathroom, so her mom and dad and Nancy didn't even notice. When she came out, there was a bulge inside her shirt, but nobody was watching. Bean marched back up the street toward Ivy's house, but she didn't stop there. She walked around Pancake Court until she was standing next to Dino, Leanna, the Sophies, and Katie. Ivy came running. "What are you doing, Bean?" Her eyes were shining. "Look," said Bean. She pulled the brown paper bag from her shirt. "I've got candy. Except it isn't mine. I stole it." "Great," said Ivy. "Who'd you steal it from?" "Nancy," said Bean. Ivy giggled. "Hey, you're supposed to be good," said Bean, and Ivy stopped giggling. "I'm going to eat stolen candy," Bean said to Dino and the other kids, "before lunch and in front of you guys, without sharing." She reached into the bag and looked at Ivy. "How's that for bad?" Everyone watched while she ate a Butterfinger. "Oh, come on," said Katy. "Give us some, please." "No," said Bean with her mouth full. "I'm so bad I don't share with anyone. Right, Ivy?" Ivy nodded, her eyes on the candy. Bean opened a pack of peanut butter cups and ate one. "Isn't your sister going to be mad?" asked Leanna. "Yug," said Bean, jamming the other peanut butter cup into her mouth. She was starting to feel a little sick. She looked at Ivy. "Aren't you going to stop me?" she whispered. "Oh, right," Ivy said. She clasped her hands together and said, "Bean, I beg you, stop stealing and eating dessert before lunch and not sharing. You've got to get good." Bean was glad to stop eating candy. "Well, okay, since you put it that way." "You should give us some to show that you're reformed," said Ivy. Bean thought about that. "No, because it's stolen, you'd be doing something bad if you ate it. All of you." "I don't care if I'm bad or not," said Leanna. "I want some milk duds." "Halt," said Ivy, stepping between Bean and the other kids. "I can't let you go down the path of badness by eating this candy." She smiled her pure-of-heart smile. "Yeah," said Bean, "and right now I'm reformed, so I can't lead you down the path of badness either." "This is dumb," said Dino. "It's just a little piece of candy." "Stolen candy," Bean reminded him. "And it's before lunch, too." "I didn't steal it," said Dino. "And what if I want to be bad anyway?" He reached around Ivy to grab the bag. But someone was already there. It was Katy. She ripped the bag out of Bean's hands and tore down the street, her white sandals flashing in the sun. Bean looked at the shred of paper bag in her hands. "Wow," she said. "Badness is catching." From bad to worse. They all stood there watching Katy run away. Suddenly, Dino slapped his hand against his forehead. "Oh no," he groaned. "Now I've got it too." He looked sideways at Bean. "I think I've got it bad." Sophie W. smiled. "Me too," she said. "I've got it worse." "Now wait a second," began Ivy. "I'm the bad one around here," said Bean. "You wish," said Leanna. She glanced at the row of front yards that lined the street. "First dibs on all the mailboxes," she said. Kids were swarming around Pancake Court. Dino stole one of Mrs. Trance's white rocks. Ivy begged him to stop, but he just stuck the rock in the exhaust pipe of Jake the teenager's car. Sophie W. ripped a bunch of grass out of her lawn. "Stop it," Ivy pleaded, and Sophie obeyed. But a minute later she hid her baby sister's shovel and pail in a bush. "Look at me," Bean hollered. She took off her sneakers and tried to throw them onto Mrs. Trance's roof. One bounced off the living room window and the other landed in the camellia bush. Bean was glad she hadn't broken the window, but she turned to Ivy and said, "Dang, I was trying to break the window." "Bean, breaking windows is really bad," cried Ivy. "You can't do that. Reform." But Bean wasn't listening. She whirled around, looking for another bad thing to do. Ivy dropped down on her front lawn. She had been running back and forth between badnesses, but nobody was getting any better. Dino was stepping on ants. Sophie S. was rubbing dirt into her shirt. Leanna was tying her mother's hose in a knot. Bean was hanging upside down from the handrail on her front stairs. Sophie W. had swallowed her gum. Ivy glanced up into the trees. Still no birds. Even the crows had flown away. Bean sat down beside her. "I can't think of anything else. Can you?" "No." Ivy looked around the yard for ideas. "Hey, a squirrel!" Ivy whispered, pointing at her hedge. "He's looking at me." Inside the hedge, a little brown squirrel was sitting among the leaves. He was holding a strawberry in his tiny claws. Every few moments, he lifted the berry to his mouth and tore it to bits with his chattering teeth. Little pieces of strawberry flew through the air, but he paid no attention. His bulging brown eyes were fixed on Ivy. "He's trying to tell me something with his eyes," whispered Ivy, staring at the squirrel. Bean nodded. "Cool." "He's saying, 'Oh, pure one, I will follow you till the end of time because your heart is like a squirrel's.'" Ivy stood and stepped toward the squirrel. "Greetings," she whispered. The squirrel leaped to its feet as though it had been stuck with a pin. Stuffing the rest of the berry in its mouth, it scampered away. Ivy frowned. She turned to Bean. "I've got it. Let's pick a bunch of strawberries and squash them. That would be pretty bad." "Great idea," said Bean. Dino ran by, dragging a big branch behind him. "I'm worse than you," he hollered over his shoulder at Bean. "We're going to touch Mr. Columbi's car," shrieked Sophie S. and Sophie W. Mr. Columbi was always telling them not to touch his car. He washed it 2 times a week with special soap. The 2 Sophies bounded toward Mr. Columbi's driveway. Leanna was stuffing her mother's welcome mat into her mailbox. Bean looked up and down Pancake Court. What more could she do? The strawberries were squished. Her sneakers were gone. She was sick to her stomach from candy. She had spit on Mrs. Trance's rose, and she had said the worst word in the world. She was pooped. "These guys are ruining everything," said Ivy, watching Dino scamper by with another branch. "Ha ha!" he shouted. "You're just a good little girl." "Who asked you?" yelled Bean. "You're not even close to bad," he yelled. "You don't even know how to be bad. You're good." Off he ran. "You're a stinky face," Ivy hollered after him. Then she turned to Bean. "Come on, Bean," she urged. "Show him how bad you are." "I have an idea," Bean said slowly. Ivy smiled. "What is it?" "It's not enough to be bad myself," Bean explained. "I think I have to do something bad to someone else." She looked at Dino tearing around with his branch, and then she looked back at Ivy. "Where do you keep your hose?"